In this video, you're going to learn 5 tips for leading worship after your pastor's sermon. Coming up. Hey, Spencer here from Leading Worship Well. This is the place where we talk about how to lead yourself well, lead your church well, and lead worship well. So if you're interested in that, click subscribe down below and let's get into it, because today we're talking about that magical moment after your pastor just steps off stage after their sermon and you get to step back on stage and lead your church in worship for that final song or two, or however you do it. And speaking of that, I want to hear from you. How many songs do you lead after your pastor's sermon, after your pastor's message? Or do you even do any songs after your pastor's message? Let us know in the comments below and I'll talk to you in a second. Thanks for leaving your answer down below. Listen, I think that time after your pastor's message is like one of the best times for us as worship leaders to make connections and actually lead our people in worship. They've just listened to a half an hour, 45 minutes, however long your pastor preaches for. They've just listened to all of that, and now they need a chance to respond. And this is like the first step in implementing whatever your pastor just preached on and actually applying it to the person's life. So with that being said, here are 5 tips for leading worship in that time slot after your pastor's message. The first thing is to coordinate with your pastor in advance. Ask them, "Pastor, what are you preaching on Sunday?" And hopefully they get you the answer before Saturday night. But whenever they give you the answer, use that to take whatever theme they've given you, or wherever they're leading your church, because your pastors are worship leaders too. They're leading them in studying God's word. Let's combine those two together and use them to strengthen each other, and use whatever your pastor gave you to help pick out the song or the songs that you're going to lead after your pastor's message. This is what I call in my church, in my worship service, like the response song, right? This is our chance to allow the people of our church to respond to what they just heard. This is their first opportunity. Hopefully whatever they just learned about in the sermon, they're going to apply that the rest of the week or the rest of their life, but we want to give them that first step. And so pick songs that make sense and are in line with what your pastor just preached about. And I'm always amazed whenever I get this compliment after church, or this comment after church, and it happens frequently, where somebody in my church will come up to me and be like, "Spencer, that was amazing today. I just find it amazing how the song that you picked out of the sermon just lined up perfectly with what the pastor preached on. Isn't that amazing?" And I'm like, it's not really that amazing, because I planned that on purpose, right? I worked with the pastor for 20 minutes to understand what they were preaching about, and then I just simply picked a song. It doesn't have to be this magical, supernatural experience. And people get so amazed by that, and they think it's some super spiritual thing, and they think it's amazing. So if it's so amazing, why don't we just make that happen every single Sunday? We can control that in advance. So let's just control that in advance. Coordinate with your pastor in advance so you can have that quote unquote magical moment where what your pastor just preached on leads right into the song that you're leading your church in response to whatever your pastor just preached. So coordinate with your pastor in advance. The second thing to help you lead worship after your pastor has just preached is to take notes while your pastor is preaching. This is going to help you in some future points that I give you here in a second, but it's going to help you remember what your pastor just preached about. There's something about writing down and taking notes. Like, it forces you to pay attention. Hopefully you're paying attention anyways, but take notes. And like, as you are taking notes, take notice of key things and always be thinking, how can I take what my pastor just taught in this moment, like this important point that I just wrote down, and how does that apply to this final song that I'm leading at the end of my service? Like, my pastor just said this line, maybe I can incorporate that into my worship leading that I'm about to lead here in the final moments of our service. And so take notes. Plus, it's respectful to your pastor. It shows your pastor that you are paying attention. And it's like very encouraging whenever you're preaching and you look out, because I've preached before, and you look out and you see that somebody's out there taking notes, like they actually care enough about what's being taught to write it down. So do that and encourage your pastor, number one, but also it helps you remember and make connections that you wouldn't otherwise make to the song that you're about to lead at the end. And that in and of itself will help you improve your worship leading as you come out of that sermon time at the end of your service. In relation to that, number 3 is to use the same language that your pastor used in the sermon and reiterate it in the final song. Those special phrases that pastors have, those sort of the modern style where they put a phrase up, like, use one of those phrases in your final song. If your pastor said something specific, reinforce it to your church one more time before they leave. Say, our pastor just said this, and now we're going to respond to it by singing this line of a song. If you can find those moments, there's going to be cohesion in your worship service, where it's not just, okay, we sang 4 songs at the beginning, and then somebody prayed, and then the pastor came up and talked about something, and then we're going to sing this random song at the end. If you want to create an impact in your services, make sure everything lines up together so you can be laser beamed focused on one specific thing or a couple specific things that you really want your church to understand during the week. And then one of the ways you can do that is to use the same language that your pastor just used and keep reinforcing these ideas over and over again. Number 4 is to remind your church that the song that you're about to sing is a response to what they just learned. Whatever they just heard, this is why we coordinated with our pastor earlier in the week, is so that we can allow this song coming out of the sermon to be a response song. Once again, we don't just want some random song for the sake of singing one final song in the service. We want it to actually tie into what our pastor just spoke about and allow it to be a response for the people of our church. So if your pastor's talking about the love of God and how God so loved the world that he sent his one and only son, like, pick a song about love and then say, like, we just heard about the work of Jesus and like how much God loved us that he sent his one and only son to die for us, and we want to reflect on that as we sing this final song about God's love. And then you sing Reckless Love or whatever, right? Like a song about love, but let people know, like, we aren't just singing one final song because we always sing a song at the end of our service. We're singing this because we're responding to the truth that we just heard. So remind your people that this is a response. I'll often say, would you please stand and respond with me? And that is how we end our services, with one final song. And number 5, be flexible. Be flexible in that time spot right out of the message. You can have something prepared, but there have been so many times where the pastor and I have even worked in advance, and like, I knew what the pastor was preaching about, but then they say this one phrase like over and over and over again, and as I'm listening to the sermon, I'll be like thinking in my head, okay, how is this going to affect that final moment that I get to lead worship at the end of the service? And oftentimes the pastor will say something and I'll be sitting there listening, and I'll be like, oh, they just said that, and this would be the perfect song for that specific thought. And then like 2 minutes later, they say the same thing again. And then 5 minutes later, they say the same thing again. And then at the end of the sermon, they say the same thing again. And I'm like, first of all, Pastor, you didn't tell me that you were going to say that whenever we talked earlier in the week. But I feel like you've said it, and that has become like the main point of the message. And I've got this song. It's not the song that I had planned. And so I'm going to sing this song because it's really familiar to my church. Maybe the pro presenter people can throw in the lyrics for it. And you can just you can follow the Spirit in that way. Or, so maybe you do a different song than you had planned. Or maybe there's just like one thing that's really, really obvious that God is pointing out to your church through the message time. And you know that the bridge of the final song that you had planned to sing is like the perfect response to that message. And so instead of starting just at the beginning like you were planning to, maybe you're flexible and you switch things up and you start with the bridge and you sing that a couple times before you go into the song like you had originally planned. So don't be afraid to be flexible. You should always be evaluating as your pastor preaches, okay? What are they saying? What's the point? How am I going to lead people in response to this in these final moments of our service? And be flexible and don't be afraid to change things up. And if you want to continue improving your worship leading apart from just that final slot out of your pastor's message, then I've got something for you. It's a free audio training that I put together called 5 Tips to Instantly Improve Your Worship Leading. In the audio training, I'll teach you 5 tips to instantly improve your worship leading. These are super simple things that you can do that aren't difficult, but you just have to make the effort to do them. One of them, I think, is to prepare in advance with your pastor, communicate in advance with your pastor. And then there's 4 other ones that if you're just aware of them, they will instantly improve your worship leading. So check that out down in the description below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me. Until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.